1949, China was the 12th poorest country in the world. So how does it go from there to eradicating extreme poverty in a country of 1.4 billion in 7 decades? That is not because of capitalism. China actually increased its average life expectancy to the highest it's ever been. Now it's at 78.2 years and surpassed the US for the first time. And it was going to be the largest initial public offering, basically largest of history of capitalism, something at like $40 billion, huge anticipated event in the capitalist world. It was going to be, make a lot of investors happy. But basically 1 week before this happens, the government just steps in and saying, no, we're pausing all of this. We don't care if this upsets your financial backers. We need to look into what's going on in this company. I was shocked. I think a lot of people were shocked the moment that the government came in and said, no, we're going to stop this IPO. This is where we understand that, yes, they are capitalists and they have a lot of money and wealth, but they don't control politics. They don't control the financial sector. They're not going to create financial risk, and the party and the politics will ultimately assert itself over it.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. Today we have with us Tings Chak. Tings is a researcher and the art director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, where her research focuses on contemporary Chinese politics and the cultural work of national liberation struggles. She is also a co-founded member of Dongsheng, a collective of international researchers interested in Chinese politics and society. She is currently pursuing her doctorate at Tsinghua University and lives in Beijing. Tings, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thank you so much for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and the kind of work you've been doing so that our viewers can find you and also get a context to this discussion.
Sure. I'm originally from Hong Kong, back when it was still a British colony. And then I actually grew up and did my education in Canada. And just a few years ago, I moved, let's say, back to China, but it was really the first time I've lived in mainland China. And I've been here basically through the last few years of the pandemic. So I'm sure we'll touch on that in our conversation. And I know that you've had our director, Vijay Prashad, on your show before. So I think your viewers and listeners will be familiar with the work of Tricontinental. So I won't speak much about that. But one of the things that I've been doing, in addition to the kind of art direction, has been leading some publications on China, on contemporary China, and also in relation to socialism, the global South, and what's of interest, I think, of people coming from movements and from a left perspective. And linked to this is this collective that you mentioned in the introduction called Dongsheng. We were formed in May of 2020, or we published our first newsletter in 2020. And remembering, kind of rewinding back to that moment, it was really, I think, the first months of the COVID situation. And there was, I think it made it really clear for a lot of us that are people from, Africa, Asia, Latin America, how much lack of information there was about China, and that we were entering a kind of new stage in this so-called new Cold War around information. And so we came together to kind of put together information about China. And so that's been a big focus of mine in the last 3 years, through newsletters, through articles, through publications, and really helping to bridge that understanding, because it was shocking to us that whether it's in, Delhi or Johannesburg or Sao Paulo, people from the global South, comrades from the left, were repeating or the same kinds of lines coming from Washington or from London. When it comes to China, it seems like they might be telling the truth, but on everything else that we have a critical eye on. So that's really the main focus of my last 3 years, being based here, first in Shanghai, and now I'm in Beijing.
Yeah, I mean that's right on the spot. I mean it's very hard for in this information war, as you said, led by the English speaking or English media. It's hard to know exactly what goes on. So I wanted to start with COVID. I read your article, and it's a very solid presentation through empirical data about how critical this struggle was in terms of protecting lives in China. This is the exact opposite of what the propaganda that we hear of. I mean, this sort of hundreds of thousands of people died in China and so on, where you in fact show that the pandemic was this critical moment where the life expectancy of China crossed that of the US. I would definitely link your article below this video, and I don't want you to repeat the sort of data and stuff, and you feel free to do that. But I wanted to particularly ask you this question, since this is something which even even some of the left buy into this narrative that the Chinese state imposed this draconian sort of lockdown against the will of the people. And as a matter of evidence, it comes down to this sort of final phase. I think you call it the fourth phase, where there were some protests, and there was some sort of impatience among the younger generation. So I wanted to ask you, what was by and large the response of the people on ground, and maybe also different groups of people about how the state handled the COVID pandemic in China?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good place to start. One of the motivations for me to write about that article, looking back in the 3 years, was also because I lived through those 3 years. Is exactly the moment I came to China and went through all the ups and downs, the lockdown for 2, 3 months in Shanghai, the 2 years that we had that were pretty much open within the borders of China. So it's interesting how much, especially the media, I think promotes this as well, the kind of collective amnesia that sets in. So for me, it was also a personal journey to kind of look back at the end. The last part of the COVID moment was, there was fatigue. There was, I think the world was tired of having to deal with COVID. But I think it was important to have a look back. And I think in terms of, I don't want to represent 1.4 billion people's, opinions on the last 3 years, because there's obviously no consensus. One of the things that there's often a flattening of,
Right.
Chinese people and the Chinese experience. Like we all have one voice and we all follow the party and, we have no brains of our own, but it's very far from the truth. I
This
mean,
is, in a way, the old Orientalist narrative.
absolutely.
The West is complicated, complex. There are different layers. You'd have to understand them even down to individuals. And when it comes to the sort of Oriental world, you can
Yeah.
just represent them through
Yeah.
very simple, naive categories, and
Yeah.
everyone gets explained through that. But yeah, sorry, go on.
It's almost in our DNA to be autocratic and authoritarian, right? The
Right.
East and then the West is this democratic place. So yes, we know this is a kind of long-standing, and I'm glad you raised that because we have to read the media with that filter as well. Because to be honest, no matter what China did, and I guess I want to emphasize is that there was no one policy that even all of the Chinese people could be opposed to, because it changed. Like the virus changed over the 3 years. It's not a static thing. Even when had the zero COVID policy, it was not one thing, and it changes with the virus, changes with the science. China is a very scientific country, so huge tests of in different cities, how to use different measures like mass testing, partial lockdowns, free PCR testing, this and that. And then also revising. There were mistakes made, there were lessons learned, and it was a constant process of that. But even still, the mainstream media from the West was criticizing China all steps of the way, right? It was draconian when there was a zero COVID strategy because, saving millions of lives and, at the cost of basically having some small portions of the country, of the population in some kind of lockdown measure, which was still a very small percentage of the whole population. It was, remember when we had the Winter Olympics, it was dystopian that there were measures being made, quite innovative measures to create a bubble to protect all the tens of thousands of workers, athletes, and international guests. And then it became another draconian nightmare when China started relaxing the policies. So it seems like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. It's draconian, whatever you do. So maybe we're just, inherently draconian somehow.
Yeah, there were.
But yeah, go
Sorry,
ahead.
I remember there were I mean, otherwise established scholars, and I'm not even talking about some right-wing fanatics, but sort of, what we might call as the left of center establishment scholars. There was a point, maybe a little after the first phase, when China had controlled the pandemic to a great extent before it came back again. And the whole world was sort of, struggling with this, rapid spread. And the narrative was, look at China, its industries are back in full swing, its economy is roaring, and it's just the rest of the world that is kept under hostage. And that fed into the sort of the global conspiracy theory. So that's what struck me when you said, damned if you do well, damned if you don't do well.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can just go into slightly, not into so much the data, but how this phasing, because I mean,
Absolutely.
part of the, this is not an official phasing scheme. It was more just a way of periodizing, let's say, for me to understand, because in the last year, 2022 was troubling, was difficult, because Omicron was the main variant. And of course, Omicron being a much more transmissible variant, the previous measures that had worked really well for 2 years inside China weren't very effective. Lockdown is not effective for the transmissibility. Also, we learned that Omicron was a much less deadly virus, a hundredth of the original variant in terms of virus load. So that was already in the period of the downgrading and reassessing the measures. But I want to take us back to sort of the first phase was really this emergency response. Remembering that when, when Wuhan had the first cases, this was an unknown virus. No one knew what this was. There were no vaccines. It was a terrifying moment, and that was emergency response. So closed down the city of 11 million people and was able to maintain 4,000 deaths, which is a high number, but that number had pretty much did not increase over the next 2 years. So it means that, I mean, when you think about a country of 1.4 billion, 4,000 deaths was one of the lowest deaths rate by far in the world. And then we entered a 2-year period, which was really this control elimination. Obviously, the borders were closed in terms of international travel. And it was using these methods of, okay, if you're traveling to certain places, you locate people who have had contact with people with cases. You only implement lockdown if there are a large amount of cases. And this was actually a pretty normal period of life. Of course, we had things like the health codes that, identify where we've been, identify if we've been in high risk places, etc. But on the whole, you could travel, you could live in that's when the factories were back online, people were back to work. It was really in this period of this Omicron and new variants, new strategies we're trying to put in place. And I think the last year was challenging. I mean, I mentioned that, I was in Shanghai lockdown for 2-3 months. No doubt that was challenging for many people. That was, of course, to save lives as well. And so in the very end, at the tail end of last year, as measures were already beginning to relax because the country understood, the science was saying, okay, this is the time to open. You have to balance the economic needs and the people's needs. And prepare, use those last 3 years to build up the medical infrastructure to the extent that they can. We have to remember that China is a developing country as much as it is the second largest economy. The infrastructure around ICU beds was basically a seventh of what the US had, for example. It's very far from, let's say, the global north advanced capitalist society. So there was training of doctors, training of nurses, creating hospitals, creating the know-how, and protecting and vaccinating the people, especially the most vulnerable. So that period was to prepare. And that's when you see some groupings of people, particularly in some of the urban centers, I would say more around younger, middle-class urban groupings that had the kind of what were called the white paper protests. for some period. And it was a couple of weeks right after a big tragic apartment fire in Urumqi that took the lives of, I think, 11 people. And that kind of sparked a sort of the kind of fatigue that people were doing. And that was true. But that was already in the midst of this relaxing measure. And it's really complicated to implement something in a country of this scale. Even when the COVID-0 was basically relaxed and the borders open, many people were also afraid and didn't actually wanted.
This is winter of 2022 we are talking about.
Yes, exactly. So about 4 or 5 months ago. And so you would have some people, parents that were, on the internet, there was a lot of discussion and debate around this question because some parents actually took their children out of school because they weren't prepared to send their kids because they were still afraid. One of the things was there was a huge spike in parents all of a sudden calling in sick for their kids, like, oh, my son has a toothache, he can't come to school. Oh, he has a leg pain, he can't come to school, because not everyone was prepared and wanted the relaxation measures. So I think we have to balance, and of course that won't be reported in Western media, but there's a huge amount of different opinions. And no doubt in the last year, there was more, let's say, fatigue and a willingness on the whole to sort of open up. And that's what we've seen in the last few months.
One of the things during the pandemic is the state's ability to infuse money and in certain ways also save livelihood. I mean, now we know that most of this infusion happened in the global north. Recent statistics shows that 80% of monetary infusion, which was a sort of fiscal stimulus that came to the state, was from the global north, and more than half actually was in the US. So this was a sort of very peculiar thing that the US state could do, but it could also do because it had the capacity. And the global south in particular, I mean, China comes somewhere in between, but the rest of the global south, the state's capacity was very, very limited in general to sort of extend or protect livelihood. And this is something which was a big issue for the left in India, because on one hand, there was the question of protecting lives, but on the other hand, there was this real question of protecting livelihood. And this sort of divided the left in India. I'm not talking about the sort of right-wing talking points that we see in the global north. Tell me a little bit about, because in your piece, we get a very clear sense about what the state did in terms of its medical responsibility, expanding infrastructure, saving lives, and so on. What happened on the sort of the more developmental side of the state?
No, I think that's a really important question because, we can look at sometimes these GDP growth numbers and that obsession with the GDP economic indices, but that doesn't really say much about how people's lives are affected, and of course, I think in the first year of the COVID, there was a lot of news around China being the only large economy that saw positive economic growth. But let's not pretend that the economy did not hit the China really hard. And of course, this means affecting the lives of people, especially the working people. And so one of the things that we saw, I would say there were three kind of areas of how China responded to it. There were huge stimulus packages. And in the early days, in the early months, more directly for individuals, like, for example, consumer vouchers or some rent relief for people, but that was not the major area of sort of stimulus. There was a lot of protection, particularly around small and medium-sized enterprises. And there were many rounds of, for example, tax relief or waiving rent for several months, especially when I was in Shanghai. Those months were particularly hard on small and medium-sized enterprises, businesses. Cutting the social, one thing was really major was cutting the social insurance payments for these small and medium businesses by around 1 trillion RMB. And this was one of the measures to try to incentivize employers from not firing their workers, so to protect workers' jobs. But another part really is the main part of the China strategy of sort of which impacts people's lives, is investment in infrastructure. We saw, $45 billion being spent on particularly roads, trains, and other public works. We know that that is a big part of creation of job and kind of stimulating
This was also
economic
the
growth.
big part of saving global capital post financial crisis in 2008. I mean, in some ways,
Absolutely.
I saw this poster that in 1949, China can save socialism. No, I guess I'm confusing, but in 1989, China can save socialism. 2008, China can save capitalism. These are these very amusing posters that I saw. So this is the sort of big role
Yeah.
that China played in the aftermath of global financial crisis
Yeah,
to sort
bailing
of,
out the US. Yeah.
yeah.
I don't know if we'll do it again though. But one of the things, yeah, I've never seen that poster, but probably it's because we like to say here in 1949, socialism saved China. And then
Yeah, sorry.
maybe,
Yeah, exactly. So
yeah.
1949, socialism saved China. 1989, China saved socialism. 1989, 1991. 2008, China saved capitalism. So yeah, this was
I
exactly
would
the,
like to say 2023, China is saving socialism too, but we can debate more about
yeah.
that.
No, that's nice. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I mean,
Yeah.
no. I mean, another thing, and it is a major issue here, is the question of unemployment. Of course, unemployment has been, not of course, but maybe this is not known to your listeners and viewers, is that China has had a very stable unemployment rate. It's more or less around 5%, and that's stayed relatively consistent. But what we've seen is a higher increase amongst the youth. And that's has grown to, it actually spiked at about 18%, and now it's down to like 17%. So it's still 3 times more than the national average. This isn't necessarily just to do with COVID. That was one of the factors. It's actually a bigger question of the sort of mismatch of education levels. As more young people are getting university educated, there is a mismatch with what is needed in terms of, say, in industry or in the sectors that are looking for workers, but aren't, the university educated graduates aren't necessarily interested in doing that. So that is one of the big questions right now, how to address that youth sector. And if I'm at the university now, and a lot of young people are worried about that question. How will the economic recovery particularly impact young people as they try to enter the workforce? But I guess, you had mentioned early in the program, and I think it is one of the ways of measuring how people are doing and how people were doing during the COVID period is around the life expectancy. I mean, because the life expectancy is something that captures a wide range of factors. It's like economic, it's educational, it's environmental, gender, variety of things. But during the COVID years, China actually increased its average life expectancy to the highest it's ever been. Now it's at 78.2 years, and surpassed the US for the first time in history. Because the US, of course, with its COVID policy, or maybe the lack of COVID policy, saw its largest decline in life expectancy basically since, I don't know, the Second World War. So I think that is a measure of that people, in terms of how people were doing and living, and a measure of people's well-being. But when I was in Shanghai those months, and I returned after the lockdown, and you can see a lot of the small businesses just went under, and that's a big challenge right now.
Absolutely. Yeah, you spoke about the sort of transition towards economy and how that economists would call it frictional unemployment, where there is a mismatch between what the economy offers and what you aspire to be, because you aspire a different sort of job. I wanted to come to your study on eradication of extreme poverty in China, because this is very, very critical. A lot of people don't understand what has happened in China since 1949, because they don't have an understanding of where the society was. And of course, that didn't end in the 1970s. The journey continued, and even those of us who follow um, Western media knows about these figures that China pulled out of poverty even in the last 40 years. So tell us a few things that surprised you when you led this sort of massive study about China's struggle to eliminate extreme poverty. What were the
Yeah,
striking features that even surprised you?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things is now when you look back, it was the end of 2020. So this is just about
What's
a year
sorry, what's the
after.
figure? Is it 832 million in the last 40 years or so since the reform?
Yeah,
Yeah, and a
yes.
significant part of that was even during the Mao years. Uh,
Yeah. Well, basically, I mean, I'm glad you're bringing that up because, um, a lot of the West, they will use the number of 850 million people that left poverty, exited extreme poverty since 1978, because sometimes that serves the narrative that it was because, oh, China
Capital.
really left the path of socialism was capitalism. And I would be on a very adamantly not agreeing with that narrative because we have to look back exactly to 1949. And I'm not going to go deep into it, but I think just to give your listeners a sense, it's 1949. China was the 12th poorest country in the world when you look at just GDP per capita. It's not the best measurement, but it says something that there were only 2 countries in Asia and 8 countries in Africa that were poorer than China. Of course, century of humiliation and the imperialist incursions, the war of resistance against Japanese fascism, all of that
The Civil
meant
War.
that China was civil war, extremely poor. And so how does it go from there to eradicating extreme poverty in a country of 1.4 billion in 7 decades? That is not because of capitalism. But of course, capital plays a role in the socialist phase. And we can go more into that, not necessarily into the theory of all of it. But going back down more to let's say, back to the countryside, I had a chance to lead this study for Tricontinental called Serve the People, the Eradication of Extreme Poverty in China. And we had a chance to go down to Guizhou, which is in the southwestern region of China, historically much more poor region and under lesser developed region of China, large numbers of ethnic minorities in the region, mountainous, beautiful place, but also a challenging landscape.
Was it in
So
the Guangdong province? Is it in the
in
Guangdong?
Guizhou province,
Okay,
I'm
Guizhou
from
province.
Guangdong province, but yeah,
Okay.
Guizhou province.
Hmm.
And so we got to go there and talk to people, and see for ourselves. You can read the government reports, but it's very different to see, okay, talk to peasants, talk to women, talk to local leaders, talk to party cadre, and see how the work was being done. I would say a few things really took me by surprise. It was there's the presence of the party, in particular the mobilization of its party cadre. So if we took the number of 850 million people since the opening up reform period, it means that China was able, largely through the economic growth and economic measures, to lift up the economic force of the masses of the people. China now has the largest middle class of 400 million people. But there was a portion of the society that had not really received the economic benefits of that. That were still living in extreme poverty, and that was mainly in the countryside. So when Xi Jinping came into power in 2013, this was the main focus of his first term. And this is the period of what we call the targeted poverty alleviation that lifted the final 100 million people in the countryside. So first of all, you need to find out who they are. This is not a statistical analysis. You have to actually
Hmm.
go to the countryside, go to the ground. And the party sent 800,000 people in 2014, the cadre, to the countryside, to tens of thousands of villages, and basically knocked on doors to find out the conditions of working people, of peasants in the areas. And that's how they
Was
identified this 100 million people.
was the barefoot doctors part of this sort of campaign as well? Which is sometimes also
So
much maligned, I guess.
yeah, it's much maligned, of course. The barefoot doctors, of course, an important legacy from the Mao eras. Doesn't have exactly in this same form that it did in the kind of popular mobilization health campaigns of the 56 and 60s, though health was a huge part. And so one of the things, and we go into a little bit in the studies, is the training and mobilization of doctors and health professionals. So for example, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I think it was in the tens of thousands of doctors were trained. And for your free education, you have to spend 2 years in the countryside. So there were these kinds of programs that were set linked to this poverty alleviation to ensure that, underserved rural communities get doctors, and also doctors get training while also getting a free education. So huge amounts of mobilization of health workers were sent to the countryside. There's a great documentary, later on I can send it to you and you can link it as well. That's on CGTN, specifically about the health workers in the countryside. That really harkened back to the barefoot doctors era. And so exactly this mobilization of the party, finding that 100 million people, because they had what's called the 3 guarantees: 1 income, 2 no worries, and 3 guarantees. China loves these like numbered kind of public policies because slogans are easy to remember, blah, blah, blah. But why I think it's important to note this
we
is
have
that
got
it wasn't
lots
just
of
about,
sorry, we have got lots of acronyms in our sort of Modi government's PR.
right. We like numbers. It's always like, 4 of this, 3 of that, 2 of this.
Even in the 50s, like 3 NTs, 5 NTs
Yeah.
campaign, 3 NTs campaign, taking charge of the industries from the class enemies and so on under Mao. But yeah, go on.
Exactly. So that continues. This was a public, mass mobilization campaign. You would say there was a lot of lessons about the mass line from Mao era that we see with this campaign, which is quite interesting. Yes. So basically, because it wasn't something just about income transfer, many countries have tried, especially in the global south, to use income transfer measures, and that does not address the issues of poverty and the multidimensional nature of poverty.
Absolutely.
So there was income. Of course, you have to know the income line, but then there was the 2 no worries, which is about food and clothing, that they are not going hungry and have proper clothing. And then the 3 guarantees, which is basic education, which in China it's free and compulsory for 9 years. Healthcare, so health was a component to it, access to basic medical care, and then housing, which has to have running water and electricity. So basically you have to meet, if you don't meet these categories, then you're eligible to be in this program. And so 100 million people were identified to still be in this category of considered poverty stricken. And then what was amazing, and I got to talk to some of the party cadre, they sent another 3 million people, members of the party, to live in the countryside. And they were living there for at least 2 years at a time, and spent those years away from their families. And you would have, I met with this one party cadre. It's 1 cadre for 5 families. So
you
basically
said 3 million?
3 million.
Okay.
Yeah, sometimes I forget the numbers are really big because like the Communist Party of China is 96 million people.
Yeah,
97 now.
Right, yeah, that makes sense, yeah.
It would be the 16th largest country if you by population.
Oh yeah, that's crazy, yeah.
Just behind Vietnam, and Vietnam is a big country.
Right.
So 3 million people sent. And there was a recognition that especially in the opening up reform period, that grassroots based building work of the party in the countryside was weakened. This you can even just read in the party's own and the government's own documents. And this was part of reestablishing that connection and through the campaign. So imagine 1 person is responsible for 5 families, for everything. You're talking about, is the kid going to school? Is that auntie getting has a job? What it was, is that uncle's door lock working? I heard amazing stories of just really anyone who's done any organizing in communities or in the countryside knows just daily life, the bread and butter questions of people, and this is how it was being organized. So you stay there until every one of your families are lifted out of poverty according to these measures. And then a couple other things that I think were really impressive was the mobilization of the whole of society. Of course, here there is strong private sector. There's also the civil sector and students, teachers and specialists, and even government officials. There was a huge mobilization to create exchange So that, for example, if a poor region, a county, for example, doesn't have the experiences in mobilizing or organizing a campaign of this level, they would pair it with a sister county or city from a wealthier, more developed region, and they would actually send, for example, a minister or a vice mayor, and the vice mayor would also be sent for 2-3 years at a time to live and work and also exchange. This was the same with teachers or specialists, whether they're specialists in engineering or agricultural production, and also private enterprises. So there were incentives to get private enterprises from the wealthier regions to invest and create industries, create businesses, tourism, a variety of sectors, to also draw in the capital, because this was not only using the finances of the public sector, but also redirecting the private sector capital to reinvest into these communities. So that mobilization of the society, of course, under the leadership of the party, was really impressive to see. And then the final thing was really and I think what touched me hugely was seeing just the protagonism, the activity of peasants and women specifically, young people, and how they also grow to become leaders. Many of them weren't at all affiliated with the party, didn't have much connection, become actual local party leaders, because in the process they were also sort of politically educated and politically motivated to become, actors and real drivers of this process.
This is amazing, because this just sort of brings out how there are efforts and policies that are undertaken to eradicate poverty, and it's not something like you open up your economy and that just happens by itself. Because if that were to happen, then why is it that neoliberalism that has devastated the rest of the global south, this is this sort of moment where China took advantage of this moment and could lift up its people, particularly in the countryside, whose poverty elimination didn't happen during the socialist times. I mean, it did in the urban areas. Poverty was more or less eliminated during the Maoist years itself. And the women question is very important. I recently met one of my juniors from Russia, and we were discussing about the Soviet times, and there is something that she said, that the biggest thing about the socialist times is that they brought women out of their homes in Russia, whose benefit we are still getting in Russia. I mean, this is something, and China is an extreme case, right? You would know better than I do. By the 1960s, 90% of women in the urban spaces, which is called as a work unit system in the socialist times, had a job. Like 90% of women having a job. Of course, then the sort of restructuring came, and because women were into this sort of inferior jobs in a way, they were the first to be hit. Some of them then got jobs in the service sectors that emerged and so on. I wanted to end this segment sort of by raising a concern that is the concern of, so we see this massive effort of poverty elimination in the countryside. Alongside, there is this concern about rising inequality in China. And recent data, World Inequality Lab, and so on. It's very alarming. And even from the lived experience, you would know better than anyone, Chinese cities are becoming like the Western cities in terms of its expense and in terms of cost of family raising and so on. And the party seems to be concerned, but tell me a little bit about what's the sense of this rising inequality in the official circles, and what are some of the measures that we've seen coming forth?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a huge question. I mean, especially I think for people from the left, comrades always ask, okay, this is all fine and good, but what about private capital? What about the inequality? What about the billionaires,
Right.
And then like we were just saying, the neoliberals also love the anti-poverty, line to say, well, capitalism solved the problems. But anyways, I think it's a good segue, because obviously eradicating extreme poverty is not the end goal. It's a huge achievement, but it's a stepping stone. and what that the government is calling, the building of a modernist socialist society. And there's many aspects that I won't go into of how that's being defined. But I guess I want to just mention that inequality has been huge. It has been the first thing that it was mentioned, especially after the announcement of the end of extreme poverty, is to address inequality, and then also the question of relative poverty, which is particularly important in places like the major cities, where the cost of living, the three mountains, as we call them, or the government has called them, which is housing, education, and healthcare costs. These are really big questions. And at the end of last year, just around the time we were loosening up the measures, the CPC had its 20th National Congress. And so some people might have followed it, but one of the big points that in Xi's report that he talked about
This
was
was the
exactly
same Congress where we see the drama around Hu Jintao, and that was
yeah.
spread
And how many
all across.
cups, how many
Yeah,
mugs she
right,
had. I mean, this is it. It's like a total smokescreen to actually get away from the
absolutely,
real substance
right.
of what was happening. I mean, it was impressive. I would encourage anyone who's, wants to understand a little bit more about the direction of where China is going, is to read the report. It's fascinating. So, and I'm going to just quote one thing that he said in there, and he says that we have identified, and I'm quoting here, that the principal contradiction facing Chinese society as that between unbalanced and inadequate development and the people's ever-growing needs for a better life. And we have made it clear that closing this gap should be the focus of all our initiatives. And prior to that, actually, he says other things, and I don't have the quotes in front of me right now, is around recognizing that during the opening up reform period, economic growth also came at the expense of some, he made some real criticisms, around the questions of inequality. The inequality not only between the countryside and the cities, but also between regions. Because
Absolutely.
the focus of developing the eastern seaboard of the not seaboard eastern coast of China during the reform period, because developed every single place in the country, meant that the western and central regions were lesser developed. But it's also
And this
around
is true even before the reform. I mean, this goes
yeah,
back to the imperial times, at least the
absolutely.
Western imperial time, where the seaports and all the eastern coast, and then the sort of northeastern part under the Japanese occupation also got much more developed in terms of its industrial
Yeah,
development.
and then you have the southern part where it was, where you have Hong Kong, but Guangzhou, and that has been a huge
Western
trading
port
port.
cities, yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
that's where the cotton textiles and all boomed, the more consumer industries, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, I know you know your Chinese history pretty well. So it is historical, not just in the opening and reform period, but you work with the real existing concrete conditions, and you're going to
Yeah, with
build
the
your
reform
paths.
period, these SEZs were also constituted. That also created a lot of regional imbalances.
Absolutely. So, in terms of like, how do you address this? Is a very strong word. I mean, the principal contradiction is around this question of inequality. How do you continue the development, but balance that with the people's needs? And closing the gap is important. So, in the last 2 years, we've actually been seeing some significant measures around this question of inequality. And I want to give just a couple examples and example of how to what China's calling basically kind of tame what the disorderly expansion of capital. This is an interesting phrase that we have to unpack a little bit. We understand that we're in a socialist phase, that any good Marxist will say that, okay, socialism is a period where we coexist with capital. But how does actually capital develop, and to what extent is it governed, and how does it submit itself to politics? How does the party actually control over capital so it serves the direction of the country and needs of the people? And so recently there's been large measures around monopolies as being identified as being this unhealthy development of capital, especially big tech. And maybe I'll give one example, because I think maybe listeners know more, is Jack Ma, who is the billionaire behind the Alibaba fintech empire, right? And he's been in the news a lot, and the West is always like, is he disappearing? Is he back? Is he disappearing? Is he back? But they don't really go into the substance of why this became a really important story around how to address questions of inequality, address questions of capital gone wild, let's say. So rolling back, Alibaba is a huge e-commerce platform, and it's like over $100 billion, and it's a e-commerce platform for online payment as well. So just to give a sense, it's really large numbers. Every year, it processes $17 trillion of payments. That's 17 trillion. That's like China's GDP. So and then of course through this they have huge, like it's a franchise of many things: media companies, film production, newspapers, like retail chains. It's huge. And through that, Jack Ma amassed $47 billion of his personal wealth. And many, for a while, Chinese people loved him because he was the symbol of like, oh, self-made man, you know um
being
darling of the West.
being rejected
Yeah,
in McDonald's
exactly, that whole
speeches.
story, right? It was like the Chinese dream story. But a few years back, there was also starting to be kind of complaints about many things, like fake products on the platforms, that there were this predatory small loans that they were lending on the platform that was indebting a lot of working class people. There was starting to be this question of, oh, we should squeeze the workers. He was like basically glorifying overwork culture. And then he started criticizing the financial system, and and kind of getting a bit too big for his shoes, let's say. And as the company started entering into the fintech and the financial sector, was really acting like a bank without wanting to follow the rules of the bank. So as we know, Alibaba, or Ant Group, was about to actually go into the stock markets, go public, at the end of 2020. And I know I'm going on a bit about it because I think it's an interesting story that highlights a way that China works. And it was going to be the largest initial public offering, basically largest of history of capitalism, something at like $40 billion, huge anticipated event in the capitalist world. It was going to be, make a lot of investors happy. But basically 1 week before this happens, the government just steps in and saying, no, 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 we're pausing all of this. We don't care if this upsets your financial backers. We need to look into what's going on in this company. And basically that's when the period of like, oh, did he disappear or not? And we're basically 3 years down the line. We know that, Jack Ma has reappeared. And what have we seen? We've seen a huge restructuring of this company to break up the monopoly. Essentially now it's broken down, I think, into 6 components. There's a huge amount of decentralization and of the decision-making power, more oversight by the government, and basically ensuring that these kinds of practices, particularly around the predatory financial practices, aren't going to be in the hands of this private company, that they're subjected to the regulations as possible. And basically it's about protecting the people's interests against monopolies that grew to a size that was beyond their shoes. And I think this is actually a really good example, of I was shocked. I think a lot of people were shocked the moment that the government came in and said, no, 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 we're going to stop this IPO. This is where we understand that, yes, they are capitalists and they have a lot of money and wealth, but they don't control politics. They don't control the financial
Right.
sector. They're not going to create financial risk, and the party and politics will ultimately assert itself over it. And
This is very different from what we see in the West, like particularly in the United States. I mean, the state just doesn't have the sort of power to go after the biggest billionaires.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the thing is, I'm just giving one example because it's more well known, but we've seen this in so many sectors. We've seen that especially in the different platform economies, but we've looked at it in real estate speculation, in the private sector, some of the private sectors, particularly around education,
Yes.
corruption, on
Also
the,
the
and also,
tech education, right? There
yeah,
was some.
basically a huge industry that was developed on private tutoring, to help, kids get ahead, and then grew into this, highly speculative, highly predatory, $150 billion industry. And that came down overnight because the government said, no, this is predatory on the children's health and on the wallets of working people. And you can't profit off of the sector of the conscious is what is what the Ministry of Education came out to say. And he said more interesting things. He said, actually, education has been hijacked by capital, and then came in and did this. And overnight, I mean, basically, some of the largest also listed companies in private education were just shut down. So these kinds of measures are at the same time, it's not just to say we're trying to eliminate private capital, but there's looking at these distortions and understanding that they are also a big cause of these inequalities, these gaps that are real in Chinese society. And on the other hand, is this strengthening of the state-owned sector and reinserting of the party in the grassroots, reinserting the party even in private enterprises. So I think there's these dual mechanisms that are happening in the last years that I think give confidence for those of us who are socialists, understand that the path of socialist construction is still ongoing, and it's a long path. It's a long journey.
Yeah, this is sort of one of the most disturbing developments that have happened in the recent years in India. I guess, if I'm not mistaken, there were about 100 billionaires prior to the COVID, and during those 2.5 years of COVID, it became more than 150. While reports have demonstrated that absolute poverty has increased. I mean, people who were pulled out of poverty line for decades of effort fell back into poverty during this time, and the billionaires number went up by 50%. The recent Oxfam reports tell us these ridiculous stories that Elon Musk paid 3 to 4% in tax between 2014 to 2018, while a flower vendor in Ghana, I guess, if I'm not mistaken, paid around 50% over $80 a month wage in tax. This is the sort of ridiculousness we are seeing, and this is global. This is not sort of one particular country. This is what happens when sort of capital cannibalize our society. I wanted to
I wanted to add one point on the
please,
billionaires,
yeah,
because people always ask about billionaires in China, and there are a lot of billionaires,
absolutely.
there are. One of the things I think is interesting, I think it's, really seeing a result of some of these, let's say crackdown measures. I think crackdown in the positive sense around these monopolies, around some of these sectors of capital, is that last year, the number of super rich, and I don't want to say billionaires because it's over 5 billion yuan, so it's not quite a billion US dollars, but they're billionaires in China, saw their fortunes declining with the biggest annual drop in 24 years, which I think is a nice number. And that on the whole, they saw themselves, their wealth drop by 18%. Of the top rich. It's marked by this group called the Huron Rich List, which is a Chinese version of monitoring the wealthy. So I think there's something around, actually some impacts we're seeing on the super rich of China, which I think it's not a bad
There
thing.
are silver linings. On that positive note, I mean, I wanted to enter something where we probably need more silver linings. And we had Vijay, we discussed about the sort of more global dimension and the Cold War dimension, the new Cold War, which is between the US and the US ganging up in a way around the Indian Ocean with this AUKUS and all this coalition formation against China. But I don't want to discuss that here since you were from China. I want to discuss something else, and you can force your way out of that and still discuss the sort of global dimension. I am particularly interested because, as a leftist, we think about global solidarity, but we also think about some sort of Asian solidarity, at least, or the regional solidarity, which is sort of, going beyond these contradictions of nation states. Um, One of the most famous books on nationalism, Benedict Anderson's Imagine Community, was written because he was provoked to think that two socialist states, Vietnam and China, had to go into war because of their border conflicts. And let's face it, I mean, the issues are in some ways remnants of imperialisms. I mean, there were empires all around, and it's that. Um, Yet China has massively grown in terms of its power, and it is sort of definitely in terms of the regional dynamics, it's the sort of the global regional hegemon. A lot of that is, of course, a part of the Cold War, but a lot of that is a sort of has regional dimensions, and smaller countries do become nervous when China and US compete, and it's both military budgets are going up like crazy, and all that stuff, and then there is a sort of arms race that it triggers in the region and so on, and we are seeing all these issues. And I'm not particularly discussing the more complicated issues of Taiwan and China, but I'm talking about, let's say, Vietnam and China in the whole South China Sea, or even the Himalayas. We see those issues coming up again and again, and that sort of make people nervous. How does the party looks at it, and how do people? I mean, I know people in China that doesn't care much about what's going on in the Himalayas. I mean, they are more concerned perhaps about Japanese, because there is a history to it, and of course Taiwan, which is a much complicated case. But how do you see, as a leftist who also thinks about the internationalist dimension, how do you look at these sort of what I would say the national contradictions, and how does that affect our sort of um, global solidarity building as internationalist leftists?
No, I mean, it's a big question. I mean, I think looking back at, China's very, very, very long history, India also has a very, very long history as two big countries surrounded by many small countries. So it's a millennial problem. I mean, China has 14 countries that it shares a land border with, and then 6 other countries that it's, shares a maritime border with. So there's a kind of level of complexity that, most countries, like, I mean, the US has never had to deal with that complexity as being a historically naval power. How do you deal with the land border questions? So I can't resolve that millennial question. So maybe that's my way of ducking away from it. But I would like to say, because you're bringing up the new Cold War, the Cold War and what's often called as the new Cold War. But I think in some ways in the Asian region, in the Pacific region, the old Cold War never really ended, Like when we think about the structures of the old Cold War, they have remained largely intact. If anything, they're expanding. I mean, of course, I don't need to tell your audience about the expansion of NATO, which should have been dissolved with the fall of the Berlin Wall, but wasn't, and now is expanding into the Pacific region. We have Australia, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand. Now the US wants to call Taiwan as a major non-NATO ally, which I don't know what that means, because from what I can say, NATO means North Atlantic. So I don't know what North Atlantic is doing in the Asia Pacific, but we are seeing those structures of Cold War still alive and well. You mentioned Japan, of course, and also the whole Quad alliance. There's the AUKUS in the region. Let's not forget, Japan still has over 50 US military bases that were never demilitarized, since the end of the World War II.
One of my
And
friends was born in Okinawa Islands. He was a U.S. Military boy, and he was born in the Okinawa Islands, spends times in Japan, comes back, becomes very, very anti-military eventually, and does sort of studies humanities.
absolutely. I mean, that is a kind of quite a when we talk about a semi-colonial situation. I mean, Okinawa under its military occupation by the US, really. And I mean, we're also seeing expansions, like not in the Philippines just a couple of months ago. For the first time in 30 years, basically the first time since the end of the Cold War, officially, right, they're building 4 new US military bases. So we are seeing, I think, a continuation, let's say, of the old Cold War. At the same time, there's some differences now. I mean, China responds in the way that it can. It's through diplomacy, more multilateral institutions, also learning from history, because that has been, when we say the new Belt and Road Initiative, it learns from the Silk Road, because we know trade has been a huge aspect of maintaining not only the big country, small country question, but also maintaining kind of peace, through a deepening of sort of these what's called the win-win relationships, right? And also, of course, in this moment, that was not the same in the Cold War era, as China and Russia have the highest level of allyship and trust than they've ever had in the history of these two countries. So I guess one of the few things I think are important, in the face of trying to create wedges and deepen maybe existing conflicts of borders that China with other countries, but also within the borders of China, looking at the bordering regions of Xinjiang, Taiwan, Hong Kong, there's been a lot of efforts to foment that unrest in those regions. And then is really a project of Eurasian integration that we are seeing, I think that is a force of peace, multilateralism, and possible development, more sovereign development for countries big and small. So one of the main things we've been paying a lot of attention to, of course, is the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which now has, I think, 9 countries officially joining in. There's more that have applied. And that comprises 60% of this Eurasian territory, including, many of these countries that have conflicts with each other, including Absolutely. With China. That's a quarter of the world's GDP and 40% of the world population. It's something to contend with. And, just as a comparison, the G7 only has 10% of the world's population and 50% of the global wealth, of course. But, the SCO is these are new multilateral regional blocks that are emerging that are important in this landscape. We have, of course, the BRI this year. There's a lot of tension on it because it's the 10th year anniversary. Now we have 47 countries yes. in the Belt and Road Initiative, largely global South countries. We've talking about nearing $200 billion in direct investment in the global South. These are, avenues towards a more peaceful international development, even with countries in conflict with one another. And I guess I don't need to mention too much about this, but the diplomacy has been a big part. China just helped broker the historic Iran-Saudi peace talk, right. which is a huge feat. So let's hope for that kind of path forward. I hope I didn't evade your question too much, but I think it is a real strategy of how China is approaching these kind of international questions.
Yeah, thanks. I enjoyed this conversation. This was amazing. And thanks so much for your time.